So it's been really interesting this week. We've had folks talking about process, the other day about what's coming with technology and where we're going to go. People talking about regulations. I'm going to talk about one of the things that can actually make one of the biggest impacts in an information governance program, and that is culture and behaviors. And I'm going to share with you what we did at BP when we were in a high-stakes, high-pressure environment to do that so that we could successfully manage all the information and data in support of the oil spill. But before I do that, let's think about, so why is this so important? What would be the business driver for doing this? So besides the bad guys who are out there who are trying to get to our information, what is the single biggest contributor to the loss of information or the improper management of information? People. This is from the 2017 cost of breach study by Poneman Institute. And if you exclude malicious and criminal attacks, the next biggest contributor is human error or people. And so how do we address that? We address that with some training and support. But really, it's a time for change. These are 3 of the top 4 obstacles to change within an organization. And this came from the best practices in change management study by CROSI in 2016. They do this study every other year. The top one was the lack of visible executive support. Now, I'm going to discard that because I'm assuming you pretty much have that if you're managing or you're rolling out an information governance program. But these are the other top 4. And these 3, along with that other one, screen for a formal change management program with the help of a change management professional. Now, I'm not one of those change management professionals, and I don't play one on TV, but I knew enough to get somebody that was a pro at change management to come and help me. So you're looking for solutions and methods that will work, and this doesn't work. You can't just keep working the same way and just work harder. And I knew that the same methods that we use to help people manage information in BP, in the bigger BP, would not work in this environment. And really, this is what we want, right? We want everybody in our organization, our colleagues, our friends, our users, to really be happy about how they manage their information and the job that they get to do with that. We hired them very, very young for the oil spill. So I'm going to share with you what we did to handle the change that was necessary, to create the culture that was necessary. And I'm going to talk about some of the business drivers. But before I do that, I always want to make sure I stop and remember that on April 20th, 2010, 11 men died in this tragic incident. And you may not have heard this, but every year on the anniversary, BP around the world would take a moment of silence to remember those people who died. And so I always want to make sure that I remember them. It was interesting. After this happened, BP stood up a separate business unit in July of 2010 called the Gulf Coast Restoration Organization. Completely separate business unit, completely dedicated to completing the response to the incident and also continuing the restoration of the Gulf both environmentally and economically. So picture this. The event happens April 20th. It's the middle of July. They stand up the organization. By then, we have 48,000 workers across 6 states around the Gulf Coast. We are using 10,000 vessels, some of them are commercial, but many of them private vessels to help with the response. We have to track and manage all the data related to that. And by then, I had 5,000, close to 10,000 knowledge workers that are creating information all around the Gulf Coast and throwing it all over the place. And I was asked to stand up the program to manage the information and data in August of 2010 so that we could get all this information together, organize it, and be able to use it and also preserve I don't know about you, but when you start a new role or you start a new job, and sometimes it seems pretty daunting, a lot of times it's exciting. But then all of a sudden you wake up the next day and you go, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And then you get that sick feeling in your stomach. How many people have had that? That was me. But I'm very, very stubborn, and I was not ready to give up. Giving up, that's not me. I'm not that guy. So the challenge is that people already have their way of managing information. And now I've got to help change that. In some cases, the way they manage information is not going to be good for us. This is a great resource. I highly recommend it. It's called Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard by Chip and Dan Heath. They have several other books out there, Made to Stick and Decisive. Great books, and they're all research-based. But changing the way people managed their information, this is really significant. And we had these business drivers that were really calling for a formal change program. We had a very diverse workforce. We had federal government and state agencies. We had contractors from every known contractor in the world. I think we decided when we were done, we had identified over 8,000 vendors that were part of this effort. I don't know if you know how hard it is to spend money, but in 6 months, we spent close to $9 billion. That's really, really hard. Just think of the number of invoices that had to be processed to spend $9 billion in the first 6 months. We were also spread across 5 states and 5 offices: Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, New Orleans, Houston. We had to make sure that people were managing their information consistently everywhere across there. The other challenge that I had facing me was I had people all the way from beginners who just came out of college or this was their second job, and so they had very little skills in managing information, to people that had been retired from large companies who said, this is the way you manage information, it's my way or the highway. And somehow I had to get these groups to meet in the middle with a consistent set of practices. We also had very, very different business use cases. So for instance, we had US Coast Guard running operations, so we had a big operational business use case. Environmental scientists that were doing research and evaluating the effect that the oil spill had had on the Gulf. They had a different use case. We also had financial analysts. We also had claims analysts that were managing the financial claims. Very, very different use case. GIS team, and various other groups that were all part of this effort to end the response and then start the restoration efforts. And as I mentioned at the beginning, and the title, Change When the Stakes Are High, we had some very, very important business drivers. For instance, as you might guess, as soon as the incident occurred, BP Legal issued a legal hold and preservation order. Makes sense. But we got a little help in May from the US government. We received a letter from the Department of Justice and from Homeland Security. People say, Homeland Security? Well, the Coast Guard is part of Homeland Security. And it was very, very specific about how we needed to preserve all the information and data from this incident. And they would be checking. So I couldn't have anybody deleting information. And one of the other challenges that was facing me was we had to have very accurate and authentic information because we had scientists that were creating research reports that would inform how we would manage the response. The head of the environmental scientists for BP came to me and she said, look, Russ, I'm telling my scientists that we are going to conduct responsible science. That means it's got to be data-based. And I don't want the data to ever be called into question. We may disagree with the government or with litigants on the conclusions, but I don't ever want the data to be called into question. So I had to ensure the integrity all the way from collection through processing, through use, and then through production. And the volumes were ridiculous. When I left the company at the end of 2015, we were approaching 4 petabytes. This is a CTD device. This device measures conductivity, temperature, and depth, and it gathers that data every 5 centimeters, and we drop these down to a depth of 1 mile all over the Gulf of Mexico. So I had to make sure that the scientists were using the right tools and we were providing them with the right data to be able to do the analysis correctly. One of the other business drivers that faced us was the operational picture. Each day we were processing information on a daily basis to provide an accurate operational picture that would help the response decide how best to use the teams to make the biggest impact and improvements. And as you might guess, we were under the gun to produce information for all of the litigation that was going on, as well as the multi-district litigation that was being tried in New Orleans by the federal court. And the volumes, as I mentioned, were extreme. And what if we failed? Failure was not an option. I don't know if people can go back in time. This last April was 7 years from when the incident was, but nobody liked BP. We were the big evil villains, and all we needed was the accusation that we were hiding information or not producing information fast enough, and we could be charged with, one of the executives could be charged with obstruction of justice or fines or other penalties. So you say, but wait, I'm not responding to the world's largest environmental disaster, so what are you talking about? Well, I want you to think about this. This is some more data from the most recent cost of data breach study. Just think about it. You lose 10,000 records that have very sensitive data, PII, maybe credit card information for 10,000 customers. That's $2.25 million based on the most recent study that came out this summer. I don't know, is that a big enough business case? So let's get started. As I said, I knew I couldn't do this alone. I brought in a professional, and we used one of the most established methodologies for change that was put together by ProSci many, many years ago, and it's called ADKAR. And so the A is for awareness for the need for change. D is the desire to support the change. K is the knowledge of how to change. A lot of people don't know how to change. We have to tell them. Ability to demonstrate the new skills and behaviors, and then R is reinforcement to make the change. So each one of these areas have different activities and different things that you need to do to affect that change effectively. So for instance, we prepared a communications plan and we worked with our leadership to roll this out and help people know what was coming. So the goal and the mantra was, we're going to create a culture of information management excellence. Now, what does that mean? And what is culture? So culture is behaviors, systems, and symbols. So for instance, we were very, very explicit about what acceptable behaviors were and unacceptable behaviors were that tied back to our information management policy. And we were, when I say explicit, we listed those behaviors. Systems, we worked with each department and created their processes. So I didn't create the information management process for the Gulf Coast Restoration and say, there you go, guys, have at it. We worked with each group. The other thing that worked very well, and I highly recommend it, do it to yourself first. What we did is we took IT, I was part of IT, we took IT and we did that process first, and then we did an after-action review and say, okay, what can we do better when we go to finance and do them next? So we did the process on us, created our own systems, our own processes, and then configured our systems. We were using SharePoint, but we configured those to support our needs, and then did that with each group. And then symbols. Symbols, they can be all kinds of things. We created things to reinforce the messages and also to help people remember what they were supposed to be doing. So for instance, we created a logo. We used SharePoint, as I mentioned. We called it GCRO Connect. It wasn't called SharePoint, it was called GCRO Connect. We were connecting with communities and connecting with our partners. And we created a 4-color, 4-piece puzzle logo, and I'll show it to you in a minute, and use that. So anytime that showed up anywhere, people knew what this thing was, what this email was, what this newsletter was. And then we also had a tagline, and it showed up in a video that we created, but the tagline was, I am, and we are I am, for information management. And it was very, very powerful. When we talk about culture, this is another great resource I highly recommend. It's a book by Dr. Henry Cloud. And he defines boundaries as being made up of 2 things, what you create and what you allow. So when you think about creating a new culture, this is right there. It's interesting, he was working with a CEO, and the company was struggling, and so he was talking with the CEO and talking to him about what would move things forward for the company. And he said, what kind of a culture would you need to move the company forward? And the CEO started describing it, and Dr. Cloud said, well, why don't you build that culture? And the CEO kind of looked up and he thought, you know, when you think about it, I am ridiculously in charge. So think about that. When you are out there trying to do this in your organization and somebody says, we can't do this, why? So I challenge you, help your CEO, help your senior leaders to understand what it means to be ridiculously charged in their organization. You can show them, you can tell them, if you do this, then you will be ridiculously in charge, and you'd be surprised how people will follow. And so when you're installing a new culture, you've got to demonstrate what good looks like and what bad looks like. And this was a really fun way that we did it. We created this poster with these kind of cartoon-like figures, and you can see it down on the right side, but there's a list of good behaviors and bad behaviors. Now, we put that up all over in all 5 offices. That's great. But one of the things that we did that was kind of fun is we hid Easter eggs. Everybody know what an Easter egg is? Little pictures, little odd things that we stuck inside of this drawing in really inconspicuous places. And then we had a contest. We sent out an email to the whole organization and said, go ahead and find all the Easter eggs. Once you're done, email it back to my team. And then if you get all the Easter eggs, you'll get a little prize. So you'd be surprised. People going, oh. And they're get a coffee, and they would stare at it for 10 minutes. And there again, these were easy ways for them to see what the good behaviors and bad behaviors were like. For instance, we show a bad behavior of using a USB thumb drive. Bad, 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 bad. So that little circle up there is our 4-color, 4-piece puzzle logo that we used for GCRO Connect, and it showed up all over the place. So when you talk about behaviors, one of the things that we had to do was address file shares. What do you do when something is approved and people are used to it, and in some cases encouraged? For instance, when I joined BP, I joined in late 2007. I was on board about a week, and I get an email all of a sudden, welcome to BP. By the way, here is your file share with a URL to it. We encourage you to put your information in here. So a lot of people, especially ones that were working on the team that came from all different companies, essentially the Gulf Coast restoration was 10% BP employees and 90% contractors. So we had all people from all walks of life. They were used to file shares. We couldn't use file shares. Why? Anybody know why? Because if you have access to add to the file share, you can delete stuff. And you don't know that it was deleted. There's no audit trail. So we said no file shares. But now the challenge is you take a behavior which is typically approved and acceptable and saying, oh, that behavior is no longer acceptable. And what's in those file shares? Do we even want to know? Almost 70% of it is debris and rot, and most of that is PII and sensitive data. You don't even know what it is. And then you don't want to make decisions on poor quality information. So this is a huge risk to an organization. So if you're not managing the Deepwater Horizon like I was, and you've got all these file shares, one of the things you can do is use file analysis tools like the ones that Active Navigation has, IBM, and Micro Focus to clean that out quickly and make a huge improvement in your risk. But how did we do that? So how do you change that behavior? Well, one, we had a very unambiguous, very black and white information management policy that was only 2 pages long. 2 pages long. All y'all that have more than 2 pages, I've been in Texas for a while, all y'all, that have more than 2 pages. Now, you might have SOPs for the guys and gals that are doing the work day in and day out, and that might be more information, but for the worker bees out there that are using the systems, 2 pages. Here's what you're allowed to do, here's what you're not allowed to do, and if you have any questions, here's who you talk to. And it works great. So we had that. We had the support of the leadership team, and so they were there to help all of their team understand the consequences of not adhering to the policy. And then we provided easy places for them to store their information. They still need to store their information, but we gave them a list of approved repositories that were easy to use. Here's another example. We had to stop using USBs. Why? Some of the information that we had was super, super sensitive. This is some data that just might scare you. This was a study that was done in the beginning of 2016 in the UK, and they found that 22,000 USB drives were left in pockets of dry cleaning. Now, they were good guys. They tried to return them, and they returned just over half. But that means just about 10,000 USBs never made it back. I have a friend who went into a dry cleaner in Houston to drop off her clothes, and there was a basket on the counter next to the cash register. Guess what was in the basket? I think I'll take a couple. Ooh, what's on that? So we had to prohibit USB drives. Now, before you do something like that, you've got to talk to the business and say, what are your needs, and you've got to give them an option. Some people were working with wicked, because I'm in Rhode Island, wicked big files. You know, like we were using, believe it or not, we had some Microsoft project files that were almost 1 gigabyte. You can't move those around on the network. And so we had to give them an alternative. So we provided them with these encrypted USB keys. They're 128-bit, they're, you know, all government standard. And so if one of these gets lost, essentially I'm losing about 150 bucks, not the information. But we didn't give them out to everybody. We had a process in place that we designed. We communicated that effectively, and we said, if you need one of these, you have to go to your department head and get them to approve it and prove that you have the business need. Then we'll give you one and we'll track it. But I guarantee you, when they got ready to leave the organization, we said, up, we got the serial number, where is it? And you've got to return it. But these work great. So if you're going to take something away, make sure that you have a solution that addresses the potential business need. We trained everybody on the policies. We did face-to-face in the beginning, then it was virtual. Whenever new people joined, even when I left at the end of 2015, we were still doing bi-weekly face-to-face training for new joiners. Somebody new would come in, we would have a face-to-face training meeting, and there we would show them good behavior, bad behavior, examples in the slides. If you're going to have change and you're going to try to create this culture of excellence, you've got to have a support mechanism. I highly recommend creating a support team. I created an information and data management operations team, and BP loves acronyms, so it was the IDMO. But they were there to help everybody in the organization. Now, some of you might say, I'm too small, or I don't have a budget. How am I going to create a team? I don't have authorization. Well, you could do what I did. I had a very, very small team for what we were managing, but you could do what I did
and you get information management champions. So maybe your team is you and a bunch of people out in the organization. So we got volunteers from each of the departments who became IM champions. We gave them extra training, and they were recognized for their help and their expertise. And then within, like finance, anybody had a problem, they were trying to do something, they didn't know how to do it, they would go find Julia and say, hey, Julia, and she would sit down and show them real quick, and the department heads would recognize them. You would not believe how much they wanted to be a part of this just to get the recognition by their peers and by the department heads. So you can create an information management operations team with yourself and a virtual team, and it worked really, really well. We also did lunch and learns. So we would set up lunch and learns, get in a conference room, and have people come in, bring their lunch, and that's free. It doesn't cost anything. So in that ProSci study that I talked about, there were some obstacles to look out for, and I already talked about the top 4, but there's some other obstacles, and I wanted to talk about and share with you how we addressed some of those obstacles. One, as I mentioned, was visible executive sponsorship and active sponsorship, not just, oh, I'm the sponsor, they've got to actually do something. And we were very lucky. The head of the organization was on board with this. He completely understood the critical nature of managing the information, not just because of the preservation order, but also so that we were making decisions that were based on the right information. And I briefed him and got him on board, and that was great. The other thing I did is I sat down with him, and I sat down with the managing attorney, and I laid out the program, and I laid out what we were going to do with the change management program, and shared with them some of the results from ProSci on their study, because that number 1, which is the lack of visible executive sponsorship, has been there for years. And both of them completely got it and agreed. And so they helped me put together a 6-minute video where they both sat there and talked about why this was so critical to the mission, how important it was to the company, and also, believe it or not, how important it was to the scientists and to the people of the Gulf Coast. Because we were collecting more information about the ecosystem of the Gulf Coast that had been collected in the last 100 years. And it was all new. Much of the data collected about the ecosystem hadn't been done for 15 years. And so we owed it to them to do this. And so they got on camera and talked about that, and we showed this to everybody in the organization. And we also showed it to everybody that came in. New joiners would have to see that video as a part of their orientation. It was very, very effective. I only wish I could share it. I don't have a copy or permission to show it, but it was great. The other thing to address that is we had those senior leaders recognize people when they were getting it right and recognizing the need for this culture. So when we would have all hands meetings, we'd do them quarterly. We'd also have stand-up meetings. So for instance, one of the offices might have a monthly stand-up meeting. I would brief those leaders, and then they would talk about the program to their team. And they would deliver the messages I wanted, and it wasn't coming from me, it was coming from them. And as I mentioned, I had the leadership team support, so I had the leader of the organization and his direct reports, but one of the things that I did is brief early and often. So I briefed them all the time. Anytime I could get on the leadership team's schedule, I would go in there and brief them on what was going on, what had changed since the last time, and what I needed from them. And one of the things I asked for them, and I highly encourage this when you do this kind of thing, is ask them to give you data owners. I told them, I don't own the data. I don't know what good environmental data looks like. I'm not an environmental scientist. We came up with 43 different information domains, and I said, I need a data owner for each one of those. Now, some owners own more than one domain, especially in environmental, but they gave me a primary and an alternate data owner so that we could work with them, so that they were the ones that determined if it was good quality information or bad quality information. So I can't stress that enough. And it's interesting. In the beginning, they were kind of like, indifferent, but then the more they learned, they really, really understood how this was going to be critical to their teams getting what they needed to get done. One of those things that was on the slide earlier was manager resistance. So when I was in those meetings with the leadership team, I said, I need your help. And they said, okay, besides the data owners, what else do you need? I need you to help me with your team leaders and your managers. So I would go meet with each department. Department head is there, their managers, and I would get that department head to explain to them why this was so important. And then when I met with the teams, the broader teams, those managers would sit in those meetings with their teams. And that was very important. So I was able to get the managers reinforcing the change and being a part of the change. This became a big problem. We were facing constant change. We had court rulings, settlements, and what's interesting is all of that information that was going on in the litigation and the settlements that were happening, it's kind of like national secrets. We didn't have a need to know. So when a settlement was announced, none of us, except a few people, and they didn't share it with anybody, we never knew. All of a sudden, we'd get up in the morning, read the paper, or get an email in the morning, we just had a settlement and for some aspect of it, or a court ruling. So every time that happened, it was a big change. There were organizational changes. In 14 and 15, with the oil price declining, there were also other organizational changes happening. So people were getting changed all over the place, besides the change I was trying to introduce. And one of the challenges is when people get fatigued around this, they stop paying attention. It's hard to get their attention. So what can you do? How do you fix that? I tried the magic wand, it doesn't work. We had fun. We made it fun. We got to do something different, we made it fun. And so what we did is we created a game called the Triple Crown Challenge. And we created 3 different sets of activities in the form of games for people to learn the processes and technologies that were needed for different types of information. And when they completed one of those games, they would get one of these little awards. And these were, I mean, we bought a bunch of them, they were cheap. They might have been like $5 each. And these are mine. And when they completed all 3 games, then what we did is we had a lunch. And the head of the organization and the managing attorney went and hosted a lunch with all the people that completed the Triple Crown. And this was not my idea. One of my team came up with the idea, but you would be surprised how high the engagement was. People would walk around the office and they would see one of these on the desk in their cubicle and they go, oh yeah, I got to go finish that. I didn't finish that one yet. It worked really well. And like I said, one of the things that we did was recognize people when they were getting it right. So we had a newsletter that we did every other week. We also sent out best practices, tips, things like that. But one of the most powerful tools, is really low tech. I used to write thank you notes, handwritten thank you notes to people that were getting it right, especially my information management champions. You would be shocked at how powerful that is. I had one lady come up to me 2 weeks after I gave her the note, and I don't expect a response, but she came up to me and she said, you know what, that made my day. And then for your special champions, if you want to recognize somebody even more, you can give them something really special, like a champion award. This is one that I received. So you might ask, why the crab? Well, it was along the theme of the golf. And so one of my team members, we challenged her. We said, hey, we want to recognize people that are champions. Can you come up with an award, but it's got to cost less than $50 because of the rules at the company. So she came up with this, and everybody loved it. And so one of my skills is surrounding myself by people that are better than me and come up with better ideas than I do. So I think, we'll go back and you remember that I said this is not going to work. We've got to do things differently. And this is what we really want. We want our people to really enjoy this and to embrace the change and be happy with it. So I hope that sharing some of these things that we did, and I know they work because they worked really well while we were doing, will help you in your change management program. And if you want my slides, with all my notes, all you got to do is text infogov17 to 444 or 44222, and it'll automatically send you my slides. You'll get a PDF with my slides and all my notes. So that's how we changed and created a culture of information management excellence.